In this video, I will show you how to deploy your own application in Kubernetes cluster. So let's look at a common setup when deploying your own application in Kubernetes. You commit your code to Git that triggers Jenkins build that packages your application with its environmental configuration into a Docker image. And this Docker image then gets pushed to a Docker registry. And this can be Nexus, it could be AWS Container Registry or some other private Docker repository. And now that you have your Docker image in the private registry, the question is, how do you get this Docker image on your Kubernetes cluster? For images like MongoDB, Elastic, some of them that I've shown you in other videos, there it's pretty straightforward because they are hosted in a public repository like Docker Hub, and anyone can access them. So I can pull them on my machine without access permission. But your own application lives in a private repository and needs explicit access from the cluster. So how do you pull the application images from private repository on Kubernetes cluster? You do that using two steps. The first one is you create secret component in Kubernetes that contains access token or credentials to your Docker registry so that it can authenticate with the registry. And second is you configure your deployment or your pod to use that secret using a specific attribute which is called image pool secrets. So I'm going to show you all that in practice. And in order to show you the demo, I have my environment already set up. So first of all, I have a Docker private repository, which is hosted on AWS. You could also use Docker Hub private repository here as well. So this is the container registry. And I have one repository there for my app, which is a simple Node.js application. I will add a link to the application in the lecture description, so you have access to the same application. And inside the repository, I have 3 images with different version tags. So we're going to use that for the demo. And locally, I have a Minikube cluster set up, which is currently empty. So we're going to start from a clean state. So the first step, as I said, is to create a secret component which will have the access token or credentials to this private repository, which will allow Docker to actually pull that image inside the cluster. So the first thing we need to do in order to create this secret is we need to log in to this repository. And for that, there is a Docker login command that looks like this. So basically with Docker login, you provide some options, which is username or password, and you have the Docker repository endpoint there. And the third one is password standard in, which basically means that you don't type in the password on the command line, but you take it from a standard input source. This is more secure because you don't have your password written in the command line history. So I recommend you use this one generally. So for AWS, if you see the view push commands, there is a login command here actually that gets the login password into standard input, and then you can do Docker login on that. So I'm going to copy this command and head back to the terminal. So this is going to get the login password for AWS ECR in my closest AWS region, and then use Docker login with the AWS username to connect to the Docker repository in my AWS account. So with this command, I will be able to log in. So if I execute that command, so Docker login with all the credentials, I see login succeeded. And what it does in the background is it creates or it generates a config.json file that holds the authentication to my private repository. So in .docker directory in user folder, you have a config.json, and this holds the repository access. Now there are 2 ways that this config.json will store the authentication. Either you will have the authentication directly here, or you'll have the external cred stored. This is more secure because your access token isn't stored in a file, but in a credential store. And this is the file that we need for the secret. So now whenever Docker tries to pull the image from my private repository, like this image, for example, it will use those credentials for this private registry to pull that image, to authenticate itself and pull that image. However, there is a small problem with this specific file, which is that I'm running my cluster in Minikube, and Minikube doesn't have access to my cred store because it's running in a virtual box, right? So it cannot access my max credential store. So this is not going to work. So when the Docker, which is packaged in the Minikube, which I explained in another video, you can check that out, how Minikube is set up. So Minikube has its own Docker. So when Docker inside the Minikube tries to pull that image from this private repository, it will see the cred store and it won't be able to access that. So this means that I'm going to need to use a different method to log into my repository via Minikube. First, I need to take the first part of this command I have here under view push commands. I just want to get the login password used in AWS, so I'll just copy this part here. So now when I execute this, I'm going to get the authentication token used to log in into AWS in the command line, which is all of this section here. So what I'm going to do now is enter the Minikube. So I'm going to SSH into Minikube, which goes like this. You can do this pretty easy. And here I am in the directory of home Docker. And just to check, there is no .docker here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to log in to my private repository from Minikube Docker directly, not from my laptop. Okay, and let's see how that looks like. So I'm going to copy that command like this. And after the password flag, I'm going to copy and paste this token here to be used as the credentials. And the final part of the login command is the URL for my AWS repository. So this one here. And this is the entire command. So you have the same username, password, and the private repository URL. So I'm going to execute that. Remember, I'm in the Minikube, login succeeded. And now if I do -a, I see the .docker directory created. And now we can see what's inside the config.json. So you see, config.json doesn't have a credential store anymore, but it has, this is the repository URL. It's the same one here. And the credentials or the authorization is inside those brackets. So right here, you have the authorization token, which is this whole thing. So depending on your setup, it might look like this for you or like this. But as I said, Minikube can't access my cred store on my operating system. So that's why I'm logging in directly from the Minikube Docker. Now what we're going to do is we're going to use that file, so this file right here, to create the secret for Kubernetes cluster. And this is a secret configuration. So basically I have the secret kind, the name of the secret, and note the type here. So it's Docker config.json, which is its own secret type for this specific use case. And the .docker config.json, the value of this attribute will contain the base64 encoded contents of this config.json file. So all of this base64 encoded will be assigned as a value here. Now, since I have my kubectl set up on my laptop, not in the Minikube, what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy that file from inside the Minikube to my host so that I can use it for my kubectl command. So I'm going to clear this up. So I'm going to use Minikube cp or Minikube copy here. After Minikube copy, we have the source, which is the file structure of our Minikube cluster. So home/docker followed by the location of the config.json file. Then we have the destination, which is my users folder, and the location of the config.json file we just viewed. And any useful commands from this lecture, including this one, are going to be collected and uploaded to a Git repository, which I'm going to link in the lecture description so you can access them there. And as I mentioned, directly having the authorization inside the config.json file is not as secure as having it in cred store. So if you are running your Kubernetes cluster on some servers, you may want to use credential store instead, but this is just for Minikube demonstration. So I'm gonna execute that. And now if I check my own Docker config, see I have replaced the content. Now I can go and create the secret from this file. So as I said, this should be base64 encoded content. So what I'm going to do is pipe that and base64 encode it. And I'm going to paste it directly in here. Okay, so this is my secret. Or if you want to spare yourself this, base64 encoding it on the command line and then copying the contents there, you can actually do that with kubectl command as well. All right, so let's clear that up and I'm going to show you that kubectl way as well. So the kubectl command will be like this, kubectl create secret, and this is the secret type, generic. So that's the name of the secret. And let's break the line to have it structured from file attribute, from which file the secret content should be created. And this is the same attribute that we have in the secret file, docker config JSON. And now we have to specify the file, which it should base64 encode. And finally, we specify the type, which is docker config JSON type. So it's going to create the secret of docker config JSON type from these files contents and set it as a value for this attribute. So I'm going to apply that. So this will do the same as applying this configuration file here. So we have our secret, my registry key in the cluster. So just to review now, we did Docker login. In this case, I did from Minikube's Docker. And then we use that file. First of all, I copied that file from Minikube to my host where I execute the kubectl. And I use that file to create the secret, which now has contents like this. Let's actually see that. Get secret. This is output YAML file that was created. And I have my data here, docker config JSON, and this is the base64 encoded contents. Now there's a second way to create this docker config JSON secret where you don't have to do it in two steps. You don't have to do docker login and then create the secret from that config JSON file. You can do both in one step. So let's see that one as well. So it's going to be kubectl create secret. And now instead of generic, I'm going to specify docker registry, the secret type, and let's give it name, my registry key 2. And here I have different flags, which are specific for Docker registry, right? So I have Docker server. So I have Docker server, which is my AWS private registry URL. So I'm gonna put that here. Then I have Docker username, which is AWS. I have Docker password, and I'm actually going to execute this command again so that I see the values, which is this whole thing here. And this is basically it. So this command will do both steps in one. So it's going to do docker login, and it's going to create a secret based on the login authentication. So if I execute this, I have both secrets, and I can use any of those for my deployment. Now you may be asking why there are two different ways to do the same thing. Can we just go with one? But there's a difference between the two. And the difference is that with this command, you can only create one secret that has access token for one Docker registry, for this specific registry, for example. But it's convenient because you do Docker login and secret creation in one step. However, if in your cluster you're using more than one private registry where you pull the images from, then it will be more practical, more convenient to go with the other option, the first one, because, for example, if you have 5 private repositories that I want to pull the images from, I can do Docker login in each one of them, and all the access tokens will get stored in this config JSON file like this. So you're going to have a list of them. And if you use that file in your secret, then with one secret, you can have access to all the repositories. So this is a difference. So depending on your use case, you may prefer to use one or the other. And now the second step is to configure a deployment for my application. So I have a deployment configuration here, and this is just the minimum configuration you need for deployment. And this is our pod specification. I have one container, the name is my app, and this is the image. And the image name of the application has to be the complete name, which includes the repository URL and the image name. So it's going to be the complete image URL. I'm going to copy that and paste it. So this is the repository URL, this is the image name, and this is the image version. Because if you just write this one, Docker won't know which repository to pull it from. And I have the port 3000 because that's where my application runs. It's a Node.js application. And now since I already built this locally on my laptop, I have that image available locally. Show that. So with this version, I have it locally. However, because we are testing pulling the image from the private repository, I want to force Docker to pull that image from a repository instead of taking it from the local Docker repository, which is on my laptop. And to do that, you can force it by image pull policy attribute. And here you can say always. And every time pod is created, this will force Docker to repull the image, even if it already exists locally on your local host. So that's what we're going to do. And the next step will be to configure this deployment with the secret. So I have to give this deployment access to the secret that I created so that it will be able to pull that image from the registry. However, I just want to demonstrate what it's going to do or how it's going to behave without that secret configuration. So I'm just going to leave it like this, and let's actually apply this configuration. Apply like this. And if I do kubectl get pod, I see this error message here. Yes. And it can connect to the container because it's waiting, trying and failing to pull the image because it doesn't have authorization. So the pod started, but container can't be pulled. So it's gonna retry now multiple times. So I'm gonna delete that. And now let's actually add that secret reference to the Docker authentication. And the way to do that is in the pod specification. So on the same level as containers, we're gonna configure an attribute, which is called image pull secrets. Image pull secrets, and here we provide the name of the secret. And this is it. These two lines will configure deployment with access to the secret that contains Docker registry access. Okay, so let's apply that configuration again. And let's see the pod. And the container is still creating. So I'll wait a second and try again. And you see it's running because it was able to pull the image. So here we see pulling image, successfully pulled image. So that's how you configure the deployment. Now, since we have the second secret as well, let's actually make sure that both are working. So I'm going to rename my deployment. Let's call it like this. And I'm going to use the second secret here. And let's execute that again as well. So this is how you configure your cluster to be able to pull the images from private repository. There is one important note here. The secret has to be in the same namespace as the deployment or stateful set or any other component that you're creating that needs to pull the image from that repository. It has to be in the same namespace. which means we have 3 applications in 3 different namespaces that all pull images from the private repository. You have to create the secret 3 times in each namespace. So to quickly wrap up, in order to configure that, you have to create a secret. There's 2 ways to creating a secret. Either you can do Docker login manually and use the generated config.json file to create the secret out of it, or you can do it in 1 step using kubectl, create secret of Docker registry type, where you provide all the credentials in that command. And the second step, you will use that secret in the deployment or any other component that needs to pull the image from the Docker registry.